Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer 2 Likely Legendary Lords video for the High Elves. Now, the High Elves are a little bit different compared to some of my earlier videos on the likely legendary lords to be appearing in Total War Warhammer 2, in that we know who the High Elf starting legendary lords are likely to be. So in this video, we'll cover both of them, as well as some legendary lords who I think will most likely make an appearance in Total War Warhammer 2 a little bit further down the line, but not necessarily at release. Now, to give you guys a bit of background, all of these legendary lords are taken from the 8th edition of the High Elf book, just because, as with my other editions of this series, that seems to be the place that Creative Assembly takes most of their information from on the armies they want to build in their game and the characters they tend to include. So that's just the point of reference we are taking our information from today. So let's kick things off. As we know, the starting legendary lords for Total War Warhammer 2 for the High Elves are Tyrion and Teclis. Now, these two are twins, and obviously being twins, they are brothers. But to really delve into the full story of Tyrion and Teclis, we have to go back a little bit to the time of the first chaos eruption into the Warhammer world, and the time of the legendary figure in High Elf history, Anarion the Defender. Now, what had happened in the world was that two polar gates, which were essentially teleportation portals to other worlds and to other realms, had exploded at the poles of the Warhammer world. Now, this explosion had unleashed untold amounts of chaos magic into the world, which allowed demons to manifest in numbers unseen before and unseen since, and just start wreaking havoc upon all the living creatures of the Warhammer world at that time, who were not already aligned with chaos. The elves were a force for order in the world, and chaos were beset on wiping out the Elven Kingdom, which was based out of the island of Ulthuan. Now, Anarion was already a well-renowned fighter in this time, and he, in a last-ditch effort, had used anything he could think of to try and find a way of crushing the chaos and saving his people. In a last-ditch effort, he went to the temple of Eltharion. Now, Eltharion is very much kind of the leader of the pantheon of the elven gods, very much the creator of the world in the eyes of the elves. He went to the temple of Eltharion, which has an eternal pillar of flame that burns with sacred fire in it. And he prayed to him and he said, "I will sacrifice my life, Eltharion, if you will just please save my people." And then, in an act of self-sacrifice, he walked into the pillar of flame. Now, to his own amazement, he walked out the other side, kind of changed. He was more than a regular elf at this point. He'd been given gifts of strength and gifts of speed, and he himself had become a living weapon, if you will, with which to fight back the Chaos Hordes, and thus becoming the first Phoenix King. So he went out into the world and started to lead the elven fight back against the Hordes of Chaos. And indeed, wherever Anarion tended to tread, nothing seemed to be able to stand in his way, and he won a series of victories, winning some modicum of peace for a while over the world. But bear in mind, chaos is still all over the place. It's just he managed to defend Ulthuan for a little bit of time. During this time, he meets a figure called the Everqueen. Now, although he was the first Phoenix King, there had for many millennia been an Everqueen. Now, the Everqueens are very much tapped into the power of the land of Ulthuan and the power of nature as a whole, and they commune with the goddess Isha, and Isha is meant to be one of their sources of power for the Everqueens. But suffice it to say, the Everqueens are an eternal symbol of hope and of health of Ulthuan, and they're usually very beautiful women, but they're not eternal. They don't live forever. The position is passed from one Everqueen to another. But the Everqueen at the time was Astarielle, and during this kind of lull in the fighting, Anarion and Astarielle fell in love and had a couple of twins. Now, these were the twins Morlian and Yvraine. At the time, the elves were in very good cahoots with the forest spirits, and indeed, Durfu from the Wood Elves, you may recognize as a character, was now kind of a well-known presence and had become very good friends with the Everqueen. Eventually, however, the forces of chaos managed to gather their strength once again and march on the lands of Ulthuan. Now, at this point, Anarion can only be in one place at a time, so vast were the hordes of chaos sweeping over the elven civilization at this time that he simply couldn't stop them all. And the chaos forces, led by the great demon Nkari, who was very much the right hand of the chaos god Slaanesh, who developed a particular taste for elven souls, was marching on the Everqueen, and indeed they managed to capture, and in a last desperate bid, as the forces who were protecting her began to slowly die away under the sheer lustful violence of the Chaos Hordes, she begged Durfu to take her 2 twin children with him through the world route and escape and save their lives. Durfu at first was slightly reluctant, but agreed and took the children away. Now, none of this was really told to Anarion, and he never really found out about it. So as far as Anarion were concerned, they found the body of his wife, and his 2 children were missing, presumed dead. At this point, Anarion was enraged, and to a certain degree, logic flew out of his head, and he decided to use every weapon at his disposal to wipe chaos off the face of the Warhammer world. To do this, he went and he flew to the Temple of Cain. Now, Cain is one of the gods in the pantheon of elven gods, but he is the god of murder. He had a sword in his temple, which no one quite knows how long it's existed for, but it's a mythically powerful weapon, the Sword of Cain, but also said to be a cursed weapon. At this point, Anarion thought he had nothing to lose. He'd lost his family, and so he went to the Temple of Cain and withdrew the sword. And in that moment, it's said that he cursed his entire bloodline from now until the end of times. But Anarion went on and continued his fight against chaos. He at one point was said to have rescued an elven damsel known as Morathi from a Slaaneshi cult, and he married this mysterious Morathi, and together they sired what would go on to become the Witch King Malekith. At this stage, Anarion has turned ever darker. It's rumored that this is the sword affecting him. He's much more prone to violence, to violent outbursts. His court has become a place of kind of depraved indifference to the crueler aspects of warfare. And it's just all seemingly taking a very dark turn for the High Elves. However, Anarion is still very much defending the island of Ulthuan, and so is still very much regarded as a hero among the elven people. One of his old friends, who he had since had a falling out with, known as Calador Dragon Tamer, has managed to devise a spell that would open up a vortex in the world that would suck out all of the excess chaos energy, essentially stopping all of the chaos demons from being able to manifest in this world. Without enough chaos energy, they can't physically manifest themselves, and so would disappear. Anarion's old friend, Calador, starts setting up this ritual, and indeed, chaos gets wind of what's going on and get a feeling, and send all their forces to go and fight Calador and stop this vortex idea from going off. Anarion is thus faced with a choice. Does he hold a grudge against a past friend and allow him to be wiped out by this Chaos Horde, or does he abandon his own home territories to go and defend his old friend and hope that this vortex idea works? Anarion, after a little bit of internal debate and going against the wishes of his new wife, Morathi, decided to go and help his old friend. And indeed, when he got there, he arrived just in time. He and his faithful dragon had to face down 4 greater demons of chaos. Now, these things are horrendous monstrosities that loom large and are essentially miniaturized versions of the chaos powers they represent. And there he met Nkari, who had been responsible for the death of his wife, for the assumed death of his children, and he faced off against this demon of Slaanesh. And indeed, Anarion and his loyal dragon managed to fight off the 4 greater demons of chaos, including Nkari, buying enough time for Calador Dragon Tamer to finish off the vortex spell, unbeknownst to them both at the time, aided by the Slan in Lustria across the ocean, who had got sense of what was going on with their powerful magics, sucking the majority of the excess chaos energy out of the world, almost instantaneously causing the armies of chaos to return back to their own realm. The day seemed to have been saved, but Anarion and his dragon were badly wounded, And in a seemingly last act, they flew back to the Temple of Cain, and there Anarion put back the cursed sword he'd lifted all those years before out of sheer desperation and grief. Anarion was never seen again. No one's quite sure whatever happened to him, but that was seemingly the end of Anarion. After this great conflict with Chaos had seemingly been settled, at least for now, Durfu returned from the old world and from Altharion and gave back the two twins to the elven people. They rejoiced, and these two twins would go on to start the line of Anarion. Them having kids and their kids having kids, and essentially introducing a number of heirs of Anarion to the Elven Kingdom. And now Yvraine, the daughter of Anarion, eventually went on herself to become an Everqueen. It said his son, not Malekith, but his eldest son, led a much more quiet life and kind of just wanted to be left to his own will. And so the bloodline of Anarion continued within High Elf society, even after Malekith and his mother, Morathi, rebelled against the High Elves, eventually causing the sundering and the splitting of High Elf and Dark Elf societies. Now, down the line of Morleon, the eldest son of Anarion, eventually were born into the family the two twins who are the subjects of our tale today, Tyrion and Teclis. They were born to their father, Prince Arathion, and their mother, Princess Alicia. Now, Princess Alicia died during childbirth, unfortunately, and Tyrion was born a very strong baby, seemingly physically adept. However, Teclis was born a very sickly baby. Now, the curse of Anarion, which we mentioned a little bit earlier, which was caused upon his bloodline when he first drew the Sword of Cain, had many different effects over the years. Some members of Anarion's bloodline had been driven mad, they'd been driven mad with power, they'd been driven just mad with whatever mental illness happened to ail them, or they'd been born physically weak or with some kind of physical deformity. At first, it was very obvious that Teclis was suffering from this curse of Anarion, but how the curse would affect his brother Tyrion is a little bit less known, or if it will affect him at all. With their mother dead, the boys were left in the care of their father. Now, their father was very withdrawn from the boys, although it is said he did favor Teclis, as he himself was an academic, and Teclis took very much to academia and scholarly pursuits like a duck to water. So his father seemed to have a more favorable relationship with Teclis than he did with Tyrion, and thus in the household Teclis tended to be more doted after. This was because both his father liked the scholarly nature of his son, but also because Teclis was always very sickly. Indeed, it took the magic and potions of the Lawmasters to keep Teclis alive, given his slender frame and proclivity to sickness. As the boys grew up around Kafik, which was their home district, they were raised by a character known as the Elder Thornbury, who tended to care for them in their father's absentia when he was busying himself away. And it's thought that a lot of his time, it was later revealed, was working away on having to restore Anarion's armor, which had been found but was in need of repair. Boys were growing up in their home area and were starting to come into adolescence. Now, this brings us to around the year 2173 of the Imperial calendar, so about 300 years before the current Total War Warhammer timeline. Now, how old exactly the boys are at this stage, I'm not exactly sure, but it's said that elven adolescence can last a long time, at least respective to our own as humans. But during the year 2173 of the Imperial calendar, Ulthuan was hit by the most severe storms it had ever seen. These storms had destroyed one of the waystones, which had been placed in order to reinforce the Great Vortex and really just help keep chaos energy out of Ulthuan itself. With one of these stones destroyed, a crack opened up in the defenses of the Elven nation, and indeed a horde of chaos led by none other then the returned greater demon Nkari had been born forth. Now Nkari, long known in the stories of legend of Anarion facing off against him and his fight against the Everqueen of old, had become something of a figure of nightmares amongst the elven people, not to mention the notions of his master, Slaanesh, devouring all the elven souls he could get his hands on. So Nkari burst forth onto the world once more at the head of a huge host of chaos and begins seemingly randomly attacking different parts of the elven territories. And no one can make hide nor hair of what he's doing. He attacks tiny villages, he attacks huge armies, small fisheries. No one's sure what exactly is going on with this pattern, and they can't seem to catch up with him or nail down where he's going next in order to set up an effective ambush or counterattack. After a while of these seemingly random attacks going on, the scholars of elven society managed to put together that what Nkari was doing was hunting down, seeming in a mission of vengeance, all of the descendants of Anarion the Defender, who Nkari had of course faced off against all those many millennia ago. And so he was trying to kill off the entire bloodline. At this point, he'd actually been largely successful because it had taken the elves so long to figure out what exactly was going on. And it said that the only two remaining descendants of Anarion on the island of Ulthuan itself, although it was thought there were descendants of Anarion elsewhere within the elven outposts, just not on their main island, but the only surviving ones on the island were Tyrion and Teclis. And so the two adolescent elven boys were summoned to the safest place in Ulthuan, the Temple of Eltharion. Again, the Temple of Eltharion where Anarion had become the first Phoenix King, remember? So the boys are summoned there and they set up there, and the elves summon all their best warriors, knowing that this will be their best chance to defeat Nkari. Not only do they know he'll be coming for the twins, but also the area around the sacred temple of Eltharion would surely burn away most of the chaos energies from which they draw power. As predicted by the scholars, Nkari was indeed hunting down all the descendants of Anarion, and he descended upon the island that housed the temple of Eltharion on the inner sea. Nkari approached the island which housed the shrine of Eltharion with his mighty chaos host, and the attack began rather inconspicuously as a spell began to weave its way over the elven defenders. They began to see illusions of pleasure, illusions of madness, and this just caused havoc amongst the ranks of the elves. They might turn on each other, they might be turned mad by the sights they saw, they might launch into lustful pursuits. No one was really sure what was going on. It was as though madness had beset a good portion of the elven army. And it was at this point that Nkari struck, his forces marching forward, lords of change in the back casting their mighty magics down upon the elven army who stood in its defense. Beasts of Nurgle lunged forward as seemingly grotesque piles of bile and filth, and they besieged the temple of Eltharion. Eventually, a creature of such girth and weight and height managed to clamber upon the wooden gates of the temple and cause the wooden beams to shatter under its immense bulk and the sheer amount of missiles that had struck it over the last several hours. Upon shattering the gates of the shrine, the forces of chaos continued to march forward upon the elves who had not given in to madness, and a desperate battle ensued that had turned from a plan of defense and counterattack into a sheer fight for survival. Elves were simply forced into little bundles, fighting back to back, brother to brother, striking down any demonic monstrosity that lunged forward at them, simply at this point trying to survive the night. Nkari, seeing victory within his grasp, marched in towards the shrine of Eltharion. The power of the Eltharion was working, however, but such was the strength of Nkari at this point that he was managing to sustain his army, although some of the lesser demons were simply igniting into flame almost instantaneously due to the sacred cleansing power of Eltharion in this place. So the Chaos, although not at the height of their strength, are still more than enough to overwhelm the remaining High Elf defenders. Ankari made his way up the stairs of eternity within the shrine of Eltharion, and all that stood in his way between him and the last of Anarion's line on the island of Ulthuan were some Phoenix Guard, and he quickly brushed them aside, slaughtering every single one of them. He entered into the chamber where the twin brothers were being kept, and Tyrion, who at this point had been taught some of the martial ways of the elven people, realized that he was the only thing that stood between this demon monstrosity and the death of his much beloved brother Teclis. So, blade in hand, Tyrion charged at Ankari, knowing that he was more than likely going to meet his death. Tyrion was hugely outmatched, and almost with a single stroke, Ankari brushed the young elfling aside, smashing him into the wall. Such was the force of Ankari's strike. But Ankari, in his arrogance, had forgotten about the sickly boy sitting in the corner, and already knowing the ways of magic, Teclis began to rain down fire upon the Chaos Demon. Being surprised by the sickly boy in the corner, Ankari was in fact wiped off his feet, and one of his many arms fell into the pillar of flame that was eternally burning within the Temple of Eltharion itself. Now, Eltharion's flame is no ordinary magic, and when such foul corruption as the arm of a greater demon of chaos deigned to enter such a sacred flame, it of course was instantly almost burnt away to nothing, and the flames began to spread over Ankari's body. Seeing his opportunity, Tyrion managed to raise himself to his feet and began to strike with blows of seemingly impossible speed at the greater demon, joined by his brother still raining down magical fire on the greater demon. Ankari began to fall back, with the flames of Eltharion still burning its flesh. Eventually they managed to fight Ankari to an edge, and he was tossed over by a strike from Tyrion into the sea below. And that was the last that was seen of Ankari at this point, and with the greater demon seemingly vanishing into the waves of the sea so far below them, the Chaos Horde itself began to give way to the sacred cleansing aura of the Temple of Eltharion itself, and all that was left behind of this once almost impossibly large Chaos Horde were these piles of ash, and the day was seemingly saved by these two adolescent boys who had fought off a greater demon of chaos. The boys earned some repute after this, and I believe they returned home to Kafik after this incident, although not for long. Tyrion, who at some point in his childhood, I'm not sure whether it was before or after the events of the Shrine of Eltharion, came under the tutelage of Corhine Ironglaive, who was the leader of the White Lions, who are an elite regiment within the High Elf army. And he recognized the very sharp strategic mind in Tyrion after having played a number of games of chess with the child, and so took him under his mentorship to teach him not only martial skill, but also military strategy as well. And he, along with Prince Ilfaris, became Tyrion's mentors in the ways of the world. When the two boys came of age, after the events at the Shrine of Eltharion, the Phoenix King decided to summon them to court. And it was decided that Tyrion would essentially be educated and trained as a potential Phoenix King in the future, and he already had his two mentors to study under. Whereas Teclis was sent to the White Tower to learn the ways of magic, and also because the White Tower was where the Lawmasters who made the potions to keep Teclis alive hailed from, and so it was thought that they could keep him alive and healthy if he set up his home there. So a number of years pass, and the boys are kept in some slightly separate place, but there's a very close bond between them, and they have this ability to kind of sense each other over long distances, and they've always been and remain close. Around the year 2301 of the Imperial calendar, so about 125 years after the events of the Temple of Eltharion, Tyrion found himself at the court of Avalon, where where the Everqueen makes her home. The Everqueen at this point is Alarielle, and Tyrion is a member of her court and is still undergoing his training to be a potential new Phoenix King, being trained in the ways of managing a kingdom, being trained in the ways of war, both strategically and in the ways of arms and weaponry. And he has a huge amount of strength and power, and is indeed becoming recognized as one of the finest warriors within Ulthuan itself. However, all is not well in Ulthuan. It is known that the outer kingdoms are being besieged by a force of dark elves and chaos hordes who have seemingly allied themselves to destroy Ulthuan in its entirety. These forces have overcome and destroyed any elven army that has stood in its way thus far. They have fought their way into the inner kingdoms and are at this moment marching towards Avalorn. The Everqueen and her handmaidens try bravely to protect her, for were the Everqueen to fall, surely the elven people would fall soon thereafter. But they are set upon by an enormous force of chaos and dark elf warriors. And although the handmaidens of the Everqueen are valiant and true warriors, they just could not stand in the way of the forces besieging them and were soon overwhelmed. Seeing that the day was lost and unwinnable, Tyrion, seeing that all was essentially lost but that the Everqueen had to be saved at all costs, found a mount for them and cleaved a path of bloody destruction through the hordes that were besieging Avalorn. He could not, however, cleave his way through all of the hordes unscathed, and indeed a poisoned blade from a dark elf warrior had managed to pierce Tyrion's side. Irrespective of this, he managed to recover and still fight his way free so that him and the Everqueen could escape. The two of them disappeared into the nearby forest and were not heard from again. Upon hearing this, the High Elves were distraught. It was assumed that no one could escape what had befallen Avalorn and that the Everqueen was dead. This just demoralized the elven warriors to an incalculable level. Teclis, however, would not believe that his brother was dead. He was sure that if Tyrion had fallen, he would have sensed it through their special bond. So he began to set about plans to go and rescue his brother from behind enemy lines. He began by forging himself a blade with lots of the deadly enchantments he learned at the White Tower, which is kind of a center of magic for the High Elves. And he began to craft this blade, and seeing his commitment to crafting this blade and his mission to rescue his brother, the High Lawmaster at the time decided to award Teclis with the High Crown of Sapphire, which is another magical item which would further strengthen Teclis's already very potent magical ability. Indeed, it's said he's so adept at using magic, it's almost as he was born to it. He's the most gifted student in the White Tower at this time. And they give him enough potions to, keep him going on his crusade to find his brother. So Teclis does this, he gets together a small military force and rides out to find his brother. Victory after victory, this new mage begins to build a reputation for himself, even reaching the ears of Malekith himself, who was leading this force of dark elves and chaos. It's said that Teclis had managed to overcome the Slaneshi champion, Albrecht Newman, who he'd managed to reduce to dust with a simple whisper, and he'd overcome Harthar Ford, another champion of chaos, and was wiping out armies and starting to win victories for the High Elves where before there had been none. However, Teclis still had not managed to locate his brother. Malekith too, feeling that the Everqueen without a body being present was more than likely still alive, dispatched his 4 best assassins to hunt her down and finish the job. But despite this, the Chaos and Dark Elf army continued charging forward, conquering more and more of Ulthuan. At this point, the only 2 locales that had seemingly been free of the curse were the were at Safri and in the Lothern Forest, as the only two last standing bastions of the High Elves. Tyrion, in the woods of Avalon, still suffering from the effects of the poison, was severely wounded. Could feel the noose closing in around him and the Everqueen. They were being hunted throughout the forest incessantly. They couldn't stop for rest or refreshment. These were dire times, and the poison continued to weaken him. The Everqueen herself was a dim reflection of her previous power due to the sheer amount of chaos corruption that had affected the lands of Ulthuan themselves. And because she draws her power from Ulthuan, the corruption that had overrun it had begun to weaken and overwhelm her. It was in this state that Malekith's assassins had finally managed to track down these two elves and set about trying to assassinate them. But Tyrion's strength of arms, despite wounded and suffering, was still too much for these highly trained assassins to overcome, and they were struck down with a vengeful fury by Tyrion. Not before one of the assassins managed to dispatch a messenger to Malekith, telling them of the position of these two, at this point, perhaps maybe more than friends, shall we say. So Malekith knew where they were and that the Everqueen was still alive. Now, unbeknown to the High Elves at this point, Malekith begins to plan for a failed incursion, because this isn't Malekith's first rodeo in Ulthuan. He has been trying to take these lands for millennia and been thwarted time and time again. So he starts to get a little bit paranoid that with the Everqueen still being alive, with these two heroes still kind of emerging from seemingly nowhere to rise up and face him, he starts to plan for an unsuccessful mission and begins filtering some of his troops back home to Nagaroth. But in order to overcome the opposition he's found and to finally destroy the Everqueen, Malekith does a deal with a devil, quite literally, and he summons Nkari, the Slaneshi greater demon we've encountered several times in our story so far. And he does a deal with Nkari to get him to kill the Everqueen and her champion who seems to have been found. And Nkari gleefully agrees. Bringing his master the soul of the Everqueen of the Elves would be a hugely satisfying task for him. So he marches out to the forests of Avalon, and soon Nkari managed to track down Tyrion and the Everqueen. And Tyrion at this point, still ravaged by the wounds caused by the assassins, by the poison that was already in his system, knew that yet again he had to face off against this foul greater demon who had haunted his youth. And barely able to stand, Tyrion vowed that he would sell his life dearly. With the ferocity of a wounded wolf, he struck out at Nkari. But Nkari, seeing what had become of this great warrior, was able to sweep him aside with a single blow, much like he had done with the adolescent Tyrion. But this time, Tyrion was not getting back up, and Nkari began to approach the Everqueen, who at her full strength would have surely been able to banish the beast with a single touch, but was at this point almost powerless just due to the sheer corruption that had overcome her homeland, could simply stare in absolute panic at this monstrosity that was slowly approaching her. And as Nkari raised one of its huge claws and started to stroke her cheek, she knew that this was the end for her, and her end would be slow, vile, and painful. At that very moment, however, a bolt of lightning struck Nkari from the skies overhead, which had seemingly darkened with clouds in a moment, and then another strike, and another, and the demon was forced back. Out of these sparks of light that the lightning was emitting, he could see a slender frame cast a shadow in the outline of the wood, and indeed Teclis had arrived and had found his brother and the Everqueen, finally managing to strike Nkari down, much like he had done when he was naught but a child, really. He, with a single utterance, managed to banish Nkari from the mortal realm, saving the Everqueen. Teclis quickly sought to his brother's aid, summoning his spirit back from the verge of death and healing his brother of the poison and the wounds inflicted by Nkari. The brothers were finally reunited and had saved the Everqueen and made their way back to one of the last remaining safe havens for the elves. Having heard the news of Nkari's banishment, however, Malekith was incensed. He immediately ordered the sacrifice of 1,000 elven prisoners to Nkari's master, Slaanesh, as a statement of revenge against this act of defiance these two brothers had caused him. Finally making it back to a safe camp on the shores of the Inner Sea on the plain of Finival, brothers managed to finally find safe haven. They were greeted by their father, who had made camp there, and upon seeing Tyrion restored to full health, presented Tyrion with the armor of Anarion, the armor of their ancestor, who he had spent so many long years trying to restore. He gifted the armor to his son. And the elves and the Everqueen, as a means of a thank you, gifted Tyrion with the finest living steed that the elves had, known as Malhandir, and he is the last of the bloodline of Carhandir, the king of horses. She also presented Tyrion with something a bit more intimate, a heart-shaped brooch made of red ruby that would be known as the Heart of Avalorn. And as a final gift, he was awarded the Sunfang, an ancient elven blade that had been crafted with the sole purpose of demon slaying. And this was all in preparation for what would seem like a final confrontation with the Dark Elf and Chaos forces. Teclis too was rewarded, having already in his possession the crown of Safri and his blade, which he had forged himself. Teclis was awarded the Staff of Lilith, a staff that would allow him to conjure even more power and tap in and commune with the goddess Lilith herself. This staff also had enough power within it to really restore Teclis to levels of health whereby he would never again need the potions he'd needed since he was a child to stay alive. With these gifts, the armies of the High Elves and these two new heroes who had risen to prominence in this conflict prepared for the showdown with the Dark Elves and Chaos, the fight really for the very survival of Elven society as they knew it. Although Malekith had sent many of his armies back to Nagaroth secretly without informing his Chaos allies, he still marched with them, and he marched still at the head of an enormous host, which made camp, it said, just over an arrow's flight away from the Elven encampment. And there they camped over for the night, each preparing in the morning to face off against each other. And in the morning, as the morning fogs rolled off the grassland, the chanting to Slaanesh could be heard across the battlefield, as well as the croaks and screeches of the Cold One lizard beast that the Dark Elves were riding. The beastmen grunted and neighed as they too were called into the ranks of this vile and corrupting army. Heading the army were both Malekith and his trusted assassin, Urien Poisonblade. Urien, an assassin at that time beyond reckoning, the best of his class, really just a walking machine of murder. And as the sun edged over the horizon for dawn, the two armies charged for a conflict the likes of which had not been seen for millennia in the lands of Ulthuan. The fighting was savage and fierce. Many great heroes rose and fell in that battle. Urien Poisonblade himself was having a devastating effect on the Elven army. He had come into conflict with Prince Eltharion, and he had fought and slayed Corain Ironglaive, essentially killing the two mentors of Tyrion. And at that point, Tyrion was not able to save them, but fought his way to Urien Poisonblade himself, and the two began a fight that would last for hours. Their blades swung at such speed that it said that some observers could not even keep up with it, and anyone of lesser skill simply backed away from the conflict between these two champions, exchanging blow for blow, parry for parry, sleight for sleight. The battle was some of the fiercest ever witnessed. Malekith attempted to strengthen his champion Urien, casting magics upon him, giving him extra strength and speed. These were countered by Teclis's contributions to the fight, and they would continue to exchange blows for hour after hour, only for Urien Poisonblade to gain the upper hand. He was thrusting at Tyrion with a blow that would surely strike him in his heart, with Tyrion with no way to parry or counter, and suddenly, through some magics, Urien's blade was turned away. Teclis was slightly puzzled by this turn of events, as he had not cast that magic. Indeed, ocean away, Marathi, who, seeing Tyrion for the first time through her magical kind of looking glass, shall we say, and watching this battle unfold, recognized in his face the face of her dear departed husband Eltharion. So alike did the two look that, out of just sheer instinct, she reached out with all of her magic ability over such a vast distance to turn away Urien Poisonblade's killing blow to save what she thought at the time was Eltharion himself. With this blow parried and Urien off balance, Tyrion managed to thrust straight into Poisonblade's chest, killing him instantaneously. A howl of anguish could be heard rise up from the Dark Elf ranks as they attempted to close the gap and space that had formed around these two twirling whirlwinds of blade when they were facing off against each other in an effort to avenge their fallen master. The Darkshards fired their repeater crossbows, blotting out the sun, seemingly heading straight for Tyrion. But in retaliation, white-fletched arrows came from behind Tyrion, causing a rain of bolts and arrows to fall down and around him. He summoned his new and trusted steed to his side and led the renewed High Elves in a charge against the Dark Elf hordes. For his part, Tyrion's main confrontation of the battle was over, but Teclis's magical duel with Malekith was yet to be resolved. Teclis, for the first time, meeting someone who had managed to match him in any way, shape, or form in magical ability, who had mastered his craft over many long millennia, and the two dispelled and cast against each other in a magical duel that had seemingly come to a stalemate. But Teclis had begun to tire, and he was aware of this in fighting what must be his great, throw in maybe a couple more greats, half-uncle? I think that's their relationship. And knowing that he was starting to fade, made a last-ditch attempt and summoned the powers of Lilith through his new staff which he had been afforded. And in so doing, he managed to cast a spell that reignited the flames of Asuryan that had long ago burnt themselves into the flesh of Malekith and reignited the Witch King into a blazing fireball of agony. Knowing that these flames were unquenchable in the mortal world, Malekith's only option was to banish himself into the realms of chaos, and so that's what he did, and he disappeared from the battlefield. Tyrion and Teclis, having defeated the champions of the Dark Elves, continued to rain down magic and charge and parry and behead and decapitate any Dark Elf they came across, and indeed, leaderless and broken, the Dark Elves were forced to retreat. The two brothers had become the saviors of their people, and indeed Tyrion took over as general of the army, and they began to lead what would be a sweeping counterattack against the Dark Elves, which would result in them being finally swept off the island of Ulthuan along with their Chaos allies. All was not well in the world, however, and one day around the year 2303 of the Imperial calendar, so around 2 years after the initial Dark Elf invasion of the lands of Ulthuan, a ragged and, to the elves, slightly primitive ship sailed into the docks of Ulthuan. Aboard this ship was a human known as Peter Lazio. And Peter brought tales of a huge chaos army marching down from the north and already reaping havoc on the lands of Kislev, and they beseeched the High Elves for any help. Now, Tyrion and Teclis actually disagreed on this, Tyrion arguing the view of many High Elves, kind of the standard traditional view, if you will, that the affairs of the world were not theirs, and that their sole duty was to protect Ulthuan itself. Teclis disagreed and saw the duty of the High Elves being that to protect the entirety of the world. So Teclis agreed to go and lend his aid to the human effort, but he did not get a High Elf army at his back, and he ended up having to go seemingly by himself. But two of his friends from the White Tower agreed to go with him. They were Yertle and Finria. So Teclis and his two mates get on the ship and they go to help the Empire. Now you might think several skinny elven lads might not be that much help, but they arrived to aid Magnus the Pious in his great war against chaos, and with the sheer magical power of these three mages, these three high elf mages, which were a control of magic beyond any of that which the humans had really been exposed to previously or had witnessed, other than coming from the hordes of chaos themselves. They proved to be amongst the most invaluable counselors and allies the newly appointed leader of men could hope to have. And indeed, they fought their campaign together, back to back. Teclis and his two friends willing to lay down their lives in the defense of humanity. Indeed, Yertle is known to have fallen during one of the battles with Chaos, leaving only Teclis and Finria to help and to aid the humans. During this entire campaign, Teclis was known to have taught some of the hedge wizards who knew some vagaries of the worlds of magic, some powerful spells to aid the armies of men, but nothing that could come close to what Teclis or Finria themselves could accomplish. Magnus the Pious, as he would become known, won the day, fought back the forces of chaos, and was crowned as the new Emperor of Men. And one of his first requests of Teclis was for Teclis to remain after this campaign and please teach men the finer points of magic and how to be able to use it and harness it effectively. Now, Teclis himself was kind of torn on this, and Finria didn't really want him to teach the men magic because men could use it against them at some point in the future. But Teclis could see the potential of men as an ally in the war against chaos, and so agreed, thus founding the different colleges of magic within the Empire. Teclis would remain in the Empire for the next 20 years, teaching and helping found the colleges of magic. And he would have remained for longer had he not got word that his father had died. So Teclis returned to Ulthuan. His brother at this point had been named champion of the Everqueen, and really was second in authority within the elven ranks, only to Finubar, the current Phoenix King, who Tyrion was eternally loyal to, but really was only second in authority to him within High Elf society. Once the two brothers were rejoined after such a long parting, they hugged, and it was a very emotional meeting, as the two brothers had missed each other greatly over the 20 plus years or so they'd been apart. And so it was a joyous reunion, although for a solemn occasion. The two of them buried their father, but Teclis had always intended to return to the Empire to continue his teachings. But while at home, he got word that the High Lawmaster had also passed away, and the Council of the White Tower had asked Teclis to take over, really as the chief magic user within High Elf society. This was a role of such honor and such high prestige that Teclis really couldn't turn it down, and so Teclis became the High Lawmaster of Ulthuan. Tyrion, for his part, while Teclis was away, was not idle, and indeed had taken part in many campaigns over the years since he'd been named the champion of the Everqueen. He defeated Eric Redax, who led a Norscan army onto the lands of Ulthuan. He himself had also been kidnapped by Marathi at one point, because, of course, she thought he was Anarian himself, and was trying to rid him of all his terrible habits, like being loyal to the Phoenix King and loving the Ever Queen. And she tried to rob him of these traits so he could go back to being more of a version of an Aryan that she knew, who loved her and would lead the Dark Elves in the absence of Malekith, who at this point had not yet returned from the realms of chaos. But if you'd like to know a bit more about Malekith and what had occurred to him, do check out my lore video on Malekith and Morathi to get their full story and the story from their perspective. Tyrion did eventually manage to escape the clutches of Morathi with the help of a character known as Helbron, which I mentioned in my Likely Legendary Lords for the Dark Elf video, if you want to know a bit more about her. But he escapes, and he has many adventures over the years, but essentially becomes one of the most important defenders of Ulthuan that the army has. Their finest warrior in itself, and one, if not their finest general as well. Finubar, the Phoenix King, who most likely will not appear as a character in Total War Warhammer 2, you may be surprised to hear as the Phoenix King, which is technically the leader of the High Elves, because he tends to be a bit more withdrawn. It said he set himself to studying away on a subject, and it's thought to be a way to save the world, but no one at this point is entirely sure what from. So he's become slightly a recluse, but will still see anyone who has petitioned him for anything or any decision. So he's not an absentee leader, but he's not also the most involved leader, and so leaves a lot of particularly the military tasks up to the discretion of Tyrion and his other generals and princes. And that about sums it up for the lore of Tyrion and Teclis. Getting on to Teclis's rules on the tabletop and how they might translate over to Total War Warhammer 2. The first item, let's maybe go chronologically. So the first item he got was the sword he made for himself to go and hunt for his brother, which is just known as the Sword of Teclis. So the Sword of Teclis gives him magical damage. It also means he manages to hit quite easily. So in Total War Warhammer, that would probably translate as a buff to melee attack, just to make sure that when he does hit, he hits fairly reliably. If it's true to rules on the tabletop, it will also be fully armor piercing, because there's no armor meant to have an effect against this sword that Teclis has put together. So that's Teclis's sword that he made himself. The other item he was given at the beginning of his adventure was the War Crown of Safri. The War Crown of Safri was an ancient symbol of the region of Safri, which is one of the kingdoms within Ulthuan, and on the tabletop it gives Teclis a boost to his wizard level, which, to try and explain, it controls the amount of spells he can use effectively. So in Total War Warhammer, that's not easily translatable across. What it essentially could give him is a massive buff to Winds of Magic Reserve. I think that would be a fairly adequate translation for the ability in Total War Warhammer. Now, his third item, which was given to him by the Ever Queen, was the Moon Staff of Lilith. The staff, which can reinvigorate Teclis, means he doesn't have to use the potions to stay alive anymore, and it also gives him a huge amount of power. On the tabletop, in terms of the rules, what the Moon Staff did was give him bonus dice to cast magical spells. So essentially gave him more Winds of Magic and quicker Winds of Magic is how it would translate in Total War Warhammer 2. Or it could reduce the cost of all spells for Teclis. So whereas maybe if one of the lures he uses is 8 to cast a magic spell in Total War Warhammer, for Teclis it's only 6 or even 4. Something like that is what the staff could potentially do in Total War Warhammer 2. So looking forward to seeing that. And his final item is the Scroll of Hoeth. Now this is a one-use item that would on the tabletop essentially allow Teclis to dispel an enemy spell. There's no dispelling in Total War Warhammer, but what can be done is give a 100% chance to miscast. So we've seen that kind of ability on items before. In terms of this scroll, I think maybe that's what it might do, which for me is a kind of item I've never really been able to use with any kind of regularity in Total War Warhammer, because catching an opposing wizard actually using a spell is not a huge window, and you're probably off doing other stuff when they tend to start gearing up to do that, rather than being able to give them a minor 100% miscast chance. So it's hard to say what they'll make the Scroll of Hoeth. They could just again make it a boost to Winds of Magic Reserve, or the recharge time to ability recovery. I think they'll probably give it something like that, because Dispel isn't really a mechanic that exists within Total War Warhammer. So that's how I see the Scroll of Hoeth being played out in the game. And that about sums it up for Teclis' magical items. In terms of his laws of magic, Teclis on the tabletop has two options in terms of what he wants to pick for his magic. He can either have all the spells in the Law of High Magic, which is kind of a specialized elven magic, but the lizard men can use it as well. So he can have all the spells in that Law of Magic, or he can have one spell from each of the 8 laws of magic. Now, this could make an interesting upgrade tree in terms of Teclis if you gave them the choice between these two options, but because the amount of spells isn't really ever the issue in Total War Warhammer. If you have a Law of Magic, you typically have all the spells within that Law of Magic. And I don't see them, now I hesitate to say this, but I don't see them giving Teclis all full 8 laws of magic. But what might be quite interesting is if they give Teclis the full Law of High Magic, and they give him an upgrade tree where he gets to pick an additional, he gets to pick additional spells, which are kind of pre-selected, but you have to pick one or the other. Maybe probably the most powerful spells in the other laws of magic as well. So he gets a choice of one or the other when going through his upgrade tree to picking various spells from various ones of the other laws of magic, rather than giving him every spell in that law of magic. So that would be quite an interesting way to upgrade Teclis. And we already know he's in the game, we've seen him in the trailer, so very much looking forward to seeing Teclis play out in Total War Warhammer 2. He should be a fun and very powerful magical lord. Although in close combat he won't be great, maybe a bit of a glass cannon in combat, can deal damage but really can't take very much. That is Teclis, and looking forward to seeing him in Total War Warhammer 2. Moving on to Tyrion and how his tabletop rules might be translated across to Total War Warhammer 2. Tyrion has already been named as head of the faction for the High Elves, so we will be getting him in the game. He has a special rule that covers him, known as the Defender of Ulthuan, and that gives him an increased range on his Inspiring Presence. Now, we've seen Inspiring Presence as an upgrade for lords, generals, and special characters in Total War Warhammer 1, so I imagine it'll operate very much the same way, but perhaps give Tyrion an expanded range as well, known as the Defender of Ulthuan upgrade. Perhaps on the top branch of his upgrade tree is a way I see that playing out, and maybe a boost to the leadership value overall, as well as a range increase. In terms of Tyrion's special items, let's start with the most perhaps sentimental one, the armor his father spent much of his life trying to reforge, the dragon armor of Anarion, his ancestor. And what the dragon armor does is, on a roll of d6, it gives him a 1+ armor save, really just so essentially making him untouchable to anyone without armor piercing on the tabletop. Now, if you're going to buff a legendary lord to that extent, I don't think they will in Total War Warhammer, but I think he will have a very high armor value, if not the highest armor value in the game, perhaps, once he gets that magic item, of course, because it's the magic item that does it. And in addition to that, so you get the armor save, but it can also protect him against magic, because it also gives him a 50% ward save, essentially, on the tabletop. So very hard to hit him with anything that's not armor piercing. And even if it kind of bypasses armor and it's magic, he still has a 50-50 shot of negating all damage you do to him through the ward save. Another benefit of the armor of Anarion is it gives the wearer the ability Fireborn, which in effect gives a better ward save to any kind of flaming damage that Tyrion might take. So if you have a creature that does mainly flaming damage, or a unit that does a lot of flaming damage, he gets an extra bonus in terms of defense against flaming attacks. So that's just another little bonus that hopefully we'll see for the armor in Total War Warhammer 2. Just a real tough customer, the armor really should give him a massive advantage in battle, and I'd like to see him become hugely buffed up with that piece of armor once he gets it in the quest chain for Total War Warhammer 2. The next item is the Sunfang, the demon-slaying sword he was awarded for saving the Everqueen. Now the Sunfang, as I mentioned in the story, is just an ancient demon-slaying sword. It's a magic weapon, and so does magic damage. It also does flaming damage, and has a breath attack. So we've seen, I think it's the ring that the dwarves get in some campaigns that has a breath attack. I think the Sunfang will get something very similar to that. So that's it for the Sunfang. Magic damage, flaming damage, and a breath weapon on top of that. So it could be potentially just absolutely shred some armies that are susceptible to magic and to fire. The Heart of Avalon, the sentimental brooch you can see here in the model, awarded to him by his love or companion or whatever you want to call it, the Everqueen. This is a cool little thing because it was given to him by the Everqueen and has some interesting little abilities on the tabletop. On the tabletop, the ruby that was awarded to him is meant to be able to save his life. So it gives him magic resistance anyway, so there's a little bonus, a little ongoing bonus. But when he suffers a wound that would otherwise kill him, he gets to roll a 6-sided dice, and if he gets 2 or higher, then he gets to save himself from that wound. Just the wound that killed him. He doesn't heal fully, but he comes back to life with that wound back. So maybe coming back to life, a little bit of health just kicked in there, but not filling up your full bar. Now, the issue with this on the tabletop was that legend tells that if this ever actually happens, his bond, his relationship with the Everqueen will effectively be severed. That's the price of the magic written into this item. Now, in Total War Warhammer, there's no confirmation of the Everqueen being a playable character, but I suspect, I'll go into it a little bit later in this video, but I suspect she may be introduced at a later date, perhaps as a free LC Lord or in her own DLC. And at that point, it'd be very interesting if, like Isabella and Vlad, although Isabella and Vlad's bonus was slightly written into the lore and into their characters on the tabletop, and this really isn't in this case necessarily, but you give Tyrion a bonus whenever he's fighting with the Everqueen, or even if they exist on the campaign map at the same time, or something along those lines. And if he is ever killed and has to make the benefit use of that item, then that eliminates that bonus for them coexisting at the same time on the campaign map or in a battle. That would be something quite interesting to see, give you a bit of an incentive to keep Tyrion alive for longer, rather than just waiting for the typical character regen. If you ever lose him in a battle, you're more incentivized to maybe look after him, to pull him out of a fight if you need to. And it just adds a little element, to the Heart of Avalon there as an item. Because I like the idea that if he ever does have to use it, it eliminates his relationship with the Everqueen. So that's an interesting little item there, maybe more lore-wise than interesting on the tabletop rules. And that about sums it up for the items that Tyrion has. So very much looking forward to this helmed champion of the Everqueen appearing as the faction leader for the High Elves, and his twin brother. Really quite a powerful twosome there, and it would be great to see them in the game and making their introduction, particularly on the world map of Total War Warhammer. So that really concludes the Tyrion and Teclis part of this video. We're going to move on to some honorable mentions of some legendary lords I also think might be introduced later on in Total War Warhammer 2, and maybe hypothesize a little bit on how they're likely to be introduced as well. So the first of these is the one I mentioned a little bit earlier and plays an important part, particularly in Tyrion's story, is Alarielle the Radiant, the Everqueen of Ulthuan. It's also worth mentioning that Alarielle is also a descendant of Anarion. If you remember our story about Anarion the Defender, he had the 2 eldest children who were the twins, one boy and one girl. The boy went on to sire his descendants, Tyrion and Teclis, and the girl, Yvraine, went on to become an Everqueen, and her descendant is Alarielle. Now, during the events at the Temple of Eltharion, one has to assume that Alarielle was actually away from Ulthuan at the time, but they are related. I think it makes them cousins, depending on how many generations have passed, several times removed. I believe that would be their technical relationship between her and her current companion Tyrion, and also of course making her related to Malekith. Like Tyrion and Teclis, Malekith would be her great appropriate to amount of generations that have passed, uncle, half-uncle. So that's how the older relationships play out between these guys. Now, Alarielle, unlike many of her predecessors, has taken a much more warmongering role than any of the Everqueens who have lived previously. Typically, the Everqueen's job is to look after the spiritual well-being of the elven people and the lands of Ulthuan, and she has this very give and take relationship with corrupting powers. So the Everqueen, as we discussed in the story, is weakened when the land of Ulthuan is corrupt, but she's also exceedingly powerful when it's not. So it ends this weird kind of dichotomy where when she's maybe needed and the land's starting to get corrupted, she's a bit useless, but at the beginning of any conflict, she's extremely powerful because the land isn't corrupted and she's using Ulthuan itself as a power source. So there's this weird relationship there, and this plays out in some of her tabletop rules, but it's something they could really play with as a 3LC Lord or a DLC Lord later on in Total War Warhammer, making her campaign maybe a little bit different in that she's perhaps more susceptible in terms of her own character stats to things like vampiric corruption, to things like chaos corruption than necessarily any other party, let's say. So that lends itself to a very interesting campaign mechanic for her alone, much in the same way that Grombrindal for the dwarves has his own sort of unique set of campaign mechanics. So that's kind of how I see Alarielle being played into Total War Warhammer 2, because also there's no real direct relationship of animosity with any other characters from any other faction, so she might be hard to wrap up in a kind of them versus them package. Now, one could debate that you could maybe just have a female fiend package and just chuck her and Helbron from the Dark Elves in the package, and I've seen some people suggest that, but I don't necessarily see that happening because there's not a direct animosity between them. There's more animosity between Helbron and Marathi directly than there is between necessarily Helbron and Alarielle, except they're just on different and opposing factions. So I see Alarielle becoming introduced very much as kind of a Grombrindal character on her own later on as a 3LC Lord is my guess. I mean, you guys might have your own opinions. If you do, drop them in the comments, let me know. It'd be interesting to see what your thoughts are on it. But Alarielle's had many of adventures of her own. She, again, as we said, had that adventure with Tyrion where Malekith tried to have her killed. She's led many warring parties out on her own, been involved at the Battle of the Silent Fields, where Morisleb, the Chaos Moon, was high in the sky, and she was having to fight off a Chaos Horde on Ulthuan. And at the very last moment, where it thought all was lost, a reinforcement army of what appeared to be ghostly figures turned up to reinforce them and helped Alarielle win the Battle of the Silent Fields. She also herself has led armies against monstrosities such as the Black Fang Chimera, which was a hugely powerful chimera which re-emerged in the lands of Ulthuan that she set about having to defend. So she's taken on this very militaristic role in the High Elf society, which upsets a lot of traditionalists. High Elves, more than anything perhaps, love tradition, love strict tradition and rules, and the fact that the Everqueen is getting up and doing her own thing, a lot of them are very unhappy about, but she is, and that's why we're more than likely going to see her at some point in Total War Warhammer 2. In terms of some of her rules on tabletop and how they might be translated across to Total War Warhammer 2, now she is primarily a magic user. She has access to the laws of life, the law of light, and the law of high magic. Now, on the tabletop, she can generate spells from one of these laws or a mixture of all of them. So she should have access to all of them in Total War Warhammer 2. The most we've seen in a Total War character at the moment of this recording is Manfred with 2. But hopefully we will see an upgrade chain with sorcerers with 3, if not more, laws of magic in Total War Warhammer 2, because the magic users in the second iteration of the game are much more powerful than the magic users in the first iteration of the game. So hopefully we'll see a bit of an upgrade for them and then being able to use multiple laws of magic when it's relevant to their characters. So in terms of some of the special rules, she has a special rule, the Boon of Isha, on the tabletop, which gives her the ability to have any unit she joins have magic damage. As characters in Total War Warhammer don't join units, this would probably be more of a radius buff. So it'd be quite a powerful radius buff, particularly against ethereal units in the undead armies, or the ethereal units in Clan Angren's armies, where she can give a buff of magic damage to all units around her within a particular radius, and a potentially powerful one at that. So that would be a very interesting rule to see in Total War Warhammer. She also has the rule Chaos Bane, which plays on this idea we've talked about her weakening under huge amounts of corruption, but being strong when there's not much corruption around. And the way this plays out on the tabletop is within a certain radius, all demonic entities, so any character titled as demonic, which might come into play in later versions of Total War Warhammer more so, when the demon armies are introduced, thought to be in the third iteration of the game. But any unit that's classified as demonic takes damage just by being within her radius. But by being in her radius, you also make her less effective at casting magic. So this is the idea that she's affected by the chaos taint of these demonic entities, but she is fighting them off and then burning the corruption away from them. At the same time, she's being adversely affected by their presence as well. So it really is an interesting rule for that kind of give and take of that relationship she has with the corrupting powers. So interesting to see in Total War Warhammer as well. And hopefully they stick to something along those lines where it is just the demonic forces throw her off her magic casting, or slow it down, or give her reduced winds of magic, something along those lines, but she is causing them damage as well at the same time. That would be a very interesting rule to see implemented in the game. The next rule is Touch of the Everqueen. This is a rule whereby Alarielle gets the skill Killing Blow in combat against forces of destruction, so kind of undead, chaos, orcs. And that's implementable in Total War Warhammer. We've seen Killing Blow implemented in Total War Warhammer already. It's kind of a boost rather than necessarily the effects it can have on the tabletop. But that would be interesting to see if she is fighting the forces of destruction. She does get Killing Blow. But I'm not sure if there's a mechanic in place yet in Total War Warhammer whereby the distinction between armies allows an ability. I'm sure it wouldn't be too hard to implement, and be interesting seeing how it's translated across. Hopefully, as in true a way as possible with Alarielle, that if she is fighting the forces of destruction, she gets this close combat ability. Although I imagine you wouldn't probably want her to be in too much close combat anyway, because she is primarily really a magic user. In terms of her items, she has the Shield Stone of Isha. Now, the Shield Stone of Isha is said to be as old as Ulthuan itself, Isha being the elven god of nature. Now, the Shield Stone is only said to be usable by the Everqueen herself, and what it does on the tabletop is essentially grants a 5+ ward save on a 6-sided dice. So 1 in 3 of all incoming attacks are saved with this ward save that this item grants. So essentially, yeah, 33% ward save. The other item she has is the Star of Avalorn. Now this is kind of the crown she wears upon her head with a single gem set in the middle, but this is said to be no ordinary gem. It's said that this gem stores an actual star that's been ripped from the heavens and placed inside it. What the Star of Avalorn does is it essentially creates a healing aura around the Everqueen. Now, in the tabletop, it would only allow you to heal 1 wound to 1 unit. So not necessarily the most kick-ass healing ability ever, but it is kind of just a general healing aura that boosts a unit around her. Now, on the tabletop, it was 1 unit you'd pick, but I imagine in Total War Warhammer, the way we've seen abilities play out is it'll just be a healing aura around her in general. And the Everqueen's final item is the Stave of Avalorn. Now, this is passed down from Everqueen to Everqueen, and it essentially translates on the tabletop to the ability to be able to cast a spell you've already cast, which normally wouldn't be allowed on the tabletop version of Warhammer. This isn't really a huge issue in Total War Warhammer. So the way I see this being translated is cooldown ability with the Stave of Avalon that refreshes all your magic cooldown time. So that's how I see it playing out in Total War Warhammer 2. The Stave of Avalon, you'd have a clickable item, it wouldn't be a magic cost, you'd click the ability and it would just put all your cooldown clocks to 0 and you'd be able to use any magical spell you wanted to use at that given time. That ability itself is maybe a 1 use per battle, or maybe just 2 use per battle or something like that, limited, but that's what the ability should do in my thinking, is that it should essentially allow you to cast the same spell twice rapidly in a row without worrying about cooldown, provided the winds of magic are there and available. That would be an accurate translation to what the item was able to do on the tabletop, and a very cool ability to have in Total War Warhammer. It would be quite a powerful ability to have in the right situation. So I think that's how the Stave of Avalon should play out. Very much looking forward to seeing the Ever Queen make her introduction at some point in Total War Warhammer 2. As I said, I think she'll probably be a 3LC Lord that comes by herself than necessarily as part of a pack. Just because I think there are other packs that might come in that make a bit more sense. And speaking of those, we are moving on to Eltharion the Grim. Now, Eltharion the Grim of Tor Yvresse is the Warden of Tor Yvresse at the moment. He was not always so, however. Now, in telling the story of Eltharion, we'll get into how I think he'll appear in Total War Warhammer 2 eventually, and he will almost definitely be part of a pack. And that pack, just to give you a bit of a preview of my thinking, will be entitled The Grim and the Green, in honor, or well, not in honor, in kind of similar way that we had the DLC pack in Total War Warhammer 1 entitled The Grim and the Grave. So let's talk a bit about Eltharion. Eltharion was a kind of known hero amongst the elves, and he was known for leading an excursion to Nagaroth that was at first extremely successful. They started to win victories against the Dark Elves in the Dark Elves' homeland and began to kind of sneak around, causing all kinds of havoc, setting ambushes, really leading a very successful host around Nagaroth. And at one point, Eltharion got maybe, let's say, a bit big-headed, perhaps, and decided to attack the capital city of Nagaroth. And he and his warriors, dressed as Dark Elves, got past the gates, attacked the gate guards, and opened the gates for the waiting army of High Elves. Now, the High Elves were eventually fought back after Eltharion was injured by a Dark Elf assassin with a poison blade, and the High Elf army retreated back to Ulthuan. Once they got back to Ulthuan and the still poisoned Eltharion, who was still suffering dreadfully, got back to Tor Yvresse, they found that their own home province was under siege by Greenskin War, and this was the War of Grom the Paunch, the very famous gobbo who ate a troll and became an enormous gobbo. And if you'd like to hear more about Grom the Paunch's entire campaign, do check the top right-hand corner now. But Grom was sieging the homelands of Eltharion, and Eltharion's father had gone out to try and stop this war. But the war was just enormous. The High Elves had never seen anything like this, a greenskin war on their own lands, and of such enormous and imposing size as well, that although any High Elf could match a gobbo in combat easily, the gobbos just swarmed over them like locusts, just annihilating army after army, and raiding and pillaging their lands. Eltharion's father, Murian, marched out against Grom the Paunch, and he was promptly defeated and killed. At the time, Eltharion was unaware of this because no one could really communicate with him. He was just so feverish and non-comprehensible, just in the wraps of this poison and what he had done, that he wasn't really aware of the world around him and what was going on. And then suddenly to Eltharion appeared a vision, and it was his father who was bearing all the scars and the wounds of battle. And he spoke to his son and explained the situation. He said, this guy Grom the Paunch has come. He has his lieutenant, the shaman Blacktooth, who is destroying the Waystones, which protect us against chaos magic here in Ulthuan. And there's more chaos magic coming to our homeland territory, and it's affecting and it's corrupting the land. You have to put a stop to Grom the Paunch and his evil wizard buddy. And Eltharion suddenly wakes up from his feverish dream to find that where his father had been standing in his dream was the old ancestral blade of his family, Fang Sword, and he picked it up and vowed to end the War of Grom. At this point, Grom had kind of marched through the countryside of Yvresse and had destroyed many waystones, so much so that in fact it's believed if he destroys one more, the entirety of the vortex will collapse and chaos will be unleashed upon the world once more. And the last waystone he wants to destroy is underneath the capital of the region. So Grom and his lieutenant Blacktooth are marching. An army tries to intercept them, led by Eltharion's younger brother, and he is cut down as well. So at this point, Grom has killed Eltharion's father and his younger brother. So Grom continues his march, and for 3 days and 3 nights, he lays absolute wreckage upon the city. The greenskin catapults are firing huge boulders into the city. Doom divers are raining down. Vast seas of gobos are just waiting to burst into the gates, and eventually the gates do fall under this incessant and overwhelming power of this greenskin war, and they begin to storm the streets. All appears to be lost. The waystone seems like it's going to be destroyed. Blacktooth, the greenskin mage, is over the city, just delighting in his victory and how powerful he's become with the destruction of the waystones, obviously being guided by the chaos forces. And then out of the kind of glint of his eye, Blacktooth just sees something darting towards him, and in a last gasp attempt to try and defend himself, starts to send some ethereal green fists towards the aggressor. But before he knows it, whoosh, his head is parted from his shoulders, and streaming past him on his griffin Stormwing is Eltharion, who has decapitated the greenskin mage. Just as his troops land on boats into the capital of the city and begin to fight off Grom's war. Grom tries to rally his troops, but in the end he is a gobbo at heart and gives up and runs away into the hills of the area. Now, Grom hasn't been seen since that day, and that was a very long time ago. Eltharion then took up a quest of making sure that no greenskin war ever threatened his beloved homeland again, and took an elven army to the Badlands and began to kill any greenskin he could find. After a while, he won victory after victory, but he began to realize that, not understanding greenskin psychology particularly well, that by killing all these war bosses, he was just encouraging more wars to pick up, gather troops, and march towards the pointy heads because they were a good bloody fight. So that's what the greenskins were doing. Upon realizing what was going on and that he was just encouraging more violence on the greenskins' part, he took his army and went home and decided to defend Ulthuan from there, from any kind of greenskin invasion. Now, Eltharion is one of the few characters, and the only one that's popping to my mind right now, there may be others, but the only one popping straight into my head, that actually has a rule on the tabletop against a single other character, who is Grom the Paunch. And so the Grim and the Green is definitely going to be a downloadable package for Total War Warhammer 2 at some point in the future. And that will introduce Grom, it'll introduce a playable greenskin faction to Total War Warhammer 2, which it won't have at launch, but I hope they don't count as a race pack, because that would be a bit cheeky. They'd introduce a greenskin faction, which would be led by Grom, who I think should maybe start after the events of this little story. So he does appear in the mountains around Ulthuan and starts to put together a war that way, and then comes down and attacks Eltharion and his ilk. But yeah, Eltharion on the tabletop hates Grom, determined to see Grom dead above all others, and I think that's where the Total War Warhammer 2 story will pick up. So we mentioned his mount already. He has a griffin, Stormfang. He has his ancestral sword, the Fang Sword, which does magic damage, and no armor saves can be made against it on the tabletop, essentially meaning it should be very armor piercing in Total War Warhammer 2. He also has the Helm of Yvresse, which is the ceremonial helm given to the wardens, which he was selected to be warden of the province after he saved it from Grom the Paunch. And so he was awarded this crown, this helm even, and it's a magical armor. It gives him better armor and gives him a ward save as well of 33%. His last item is the Talisman of Hoeth, which is a medallion which essentially allows to wear a magic resistance, and it makes you a wizard. So Eltharion is really a fighter, but this medallion makes him a low-level wizard and gives him the magical knowledge of its previous owner, which allows him to use magic. Now, this would essentially allow Eltharion to have a couple of spells on the tabletop, so maybe he has a very limited magical upgrade pool, but he's really able to use magic from all 8 laws of magic found in the Total War Warhammer world, but he's a very low-level wizard, so that would limit the number of spells you had on the tabletop, but we haven't really had a limiting factor in terms of numbers of spells in Total War Warhammer. So what I see Creative Assembly doing in this case is maybe just giving him 2 or 3, or maybe at most 4 spells, or maybe 4 slots for spells and making them multiple choice. You can kind of pick one or the other and just give you an upgrade. So 4 slots with 1 powerful spell from each law of magic, but you only have to get to pick 1 from each of the 4 slots, if you get what I mean by that one. So a very limited amount of magic spells he should be able to pick from, but he should be able to do magic spells as well. And that's what the Talisman of Hoeth allows him to do. So an interesting kind of melee-focused wizard who's first and foremost a warrior, and secondly kind of has a couple of magic spells on the side. So that'd be a very interesting thing to see in Total War Warhammer. So yeah, I'd almost bank on this being the first DLC for Total War Warhammer 2, would be maybe my guess. So we get the Grim and the Green, because there is just such animosity between these 2 characters, and enabling you to play as greenskins on the map might be a bit of fun for them in Creative Assembly for the Elven regions, and would add something new to the dynamic of the Total War Warhammer 2 campaign map, the Vortex map by itself. So that's what I see happening for Eltharion. Another character who's a bit more, dark and broody is Alith Anar. Now, Alith Anar was the successor to Malekith, once Malekith decided to rebel against the Phoenix King. Now, once Malekith was defeated and driven from Ulthuan, the area he ruled at one point, Nagarath, was awarded to Alith Anar, who was a rightful heir. He kind of was next in line of succession. His family have over centuries been selectively wiped out by Malekith himself, who was just looking to get rid of them as any kind of political opposition. And Alith Anar was the last remaining survivor of his great bloodline. He has a hatred for Dark Elves. He hates those guys. As far as he's concerned, they ruined his homeland, they perverted his homeland, and he will hunt down and murder Dark Elves at any given opportunity. At the time when Malekith first left Ulthuan, there are a number of Dark Elves still in his land, and he took great relish in hunting every single one of them down, often crucifying them. At one point, after a battle known as the Battle of Griffin Pass, he said to have had 1,000-odd Dark Elf survivors, and he pinned them all to the cliffs overlooking his shore, which faced Nagaroth, and he just had them all pinned to it until they died and rotted away, being pinned to that cliff by their hands. They said that some of the marks from the nails being driven into the cliff can still be seen to this very day. Elves are not immortal, and they do have a limited lifespan, although it is a couple of thousand, if not a few thousand years. Now, Alith Anar eventually disappears, and no one's quite sure what happened to him. It's rumored that he still stalks the lands, hunting Dark Elves at any given opportunity. Some pass this off as folklore, but he is essentially a ranger who loves killing Dark Elves and may be a figure more of legend now than of reality. But that is Alith Anar. Now, he has a couple of fun weapons. He'd be more of a skirmisher lord, and I think that would add a very interesting aspect to a high elf army of having skirmisher lords, because they are meant to be very good archers as well as melee focused lords. And so far, all the characters we've spoken about have either been magic users or melee focused, and Alith Anar would allow them to introduce a more skirmishing focused legendary lord to Total War Warhammer 2. There's a very famous instant by which he acquired one of his magical items that he has on the tabletop, and it's said that Alith Anar actually went to Nagaroth itself, snuck into the capital, and danced at a ball with none other than Marathi. On the same night, he sneaked in and stole an item known as the Stone of Midnight, and then snuck out. And for this reason and this story, he became known throughout the land as the Shadow King. So that's who Alith Anar is. Sneaky, murderous ranger who's a bit kick-ass. And if I ever get around to doing a Missing Legendary Lords lore video on the High Elves when they come out, I'll delve into him in a little bit more detail, but he's a fun character. In terms of some of his magic items, we mentioned the Stone of Midnight, and that gives him a 50% ward save, effectively against any oncoming damage. He also has the Shadow Crown, which is said to be just a simple silver circlet he wears around his head, and that allows him Swift Stride. The idea is he's able to freeze time, and he's able to move during that frozen time, which makes him very quick. Swift Stride is a special tabletop rule, which can't really be applied to Total War Warhammer 2, but essentially it means he'd be very quick in Total War Warhammer 2. He also has the Moon Bow, which is, although a bow, acts as strong as a bolt thrower on the tabletop version of the game. It does magical damage. There's no armor saves that can be taken against it, so it should be hugely armor piercing as well. And any Dark Elf unit hit by this magical bow would take a debuff in leadership, effectively. So we've seen that happen with missiles before in Total War Warhammer, and will probably be translated across in a similar way for this character, Alith Anar. So that's him with the Moonbow. And yeah, very cool character who I really hope we do see introduced in Total War Warhammer 2. But for me, is one of the longer shots. We're starting to get into the realms of lesser likely legendary lords. I mean, if we go through, we've got Tyrion Teclis, the Everqueen, and Eltharion, who I think are locks at some point in the game. We're already up to 4, and that was kind of the ending point for Total War Warhammer for a lot of factions. So we'll see what we end up getting. Hopefully we go as far as Alith Anar. Fingers crossed. Now, moving even further down the kind of what maybe pessimistically I think of as the characters and lords we're less likely to see in Total War Warhammer 2, we have these two characters here. These are Corhill, the captain of the White Lions, and Caradrian, the captain of the Phoenix Guard. Now, the White Lions and the Phoenix Guard are two very elite types of unit in the High Elf army, and these are very much their champions. Now, these guys are heroes in the tabletop version of the game, and we haven't had a lot of heroes translated across to Total War Warhammer, which makes me have to put these guys near the bottom of the list in terms of characters we're likely to see introduced in Total War Warhammer 2. But they are cool characters. I'll maybe get into them in more detail in another video, but I just wanted to mention them to you guys. But for my money, these two are probably the least likely legendary lords to be introduced into Total War Warhammer. Hopefully legendary heroes becomes more of a thing in the game, and we get to see characters like these turn up a bit more often. But fingers crossed for that. You never know. But just towards the back end of the legendary lord queue for me in terms of the High Elf army. But as you can see, they're kind of kick-ass. They're elite warriors in their own right, and would be very fun to play in Total War Warhammer 2. But that about sums it up, guys, for the legendary lords who are likely to appear in Total War Warhammer 2 for the High Elf army. I hope you guys enjoyed that one. Do please subscribe and drop a like if you did. It would be greatly appreciated and really helps the channel out. As always, a huge thank you to all of you for watching, and especially to my patrons, John, Reese, Colin, Thomas, and Mateus. You guys are great, and thank you very much for supporting me on Patreon. And I hope you guys all enjoy that. And as always, thanks for joining me, and I hope to catch you all on the next one.